Kate Mulafalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. We are starting video number 3 of The Invasion of Eden by the fabulous Paul Wallis. This is my second attempt at recording this. My internet went out, so fingers crossed. Of course, if my internet goes out, you're not going to see this anyway, so well, let us just continue from last week. We're on the beginning of chapter 6. We just talked about the fact that what if these Hebrew, ancient, Old Testament-esque scriptures are really describing not a god, not connections with anything religious, but alien invasion? What if? So chapter 6 is called Invasion and Body Snatchers, which sounds quite promising. Paul needs to remind us here that this is not a conventional reading of the Bible. I think we got that he saw after about 15 years of doing source analysis, form analysis, and linguistic analysis that it's very likely that something else is going on. In the 1870s, a guy called George Smith did a translation of cuneiform tablets that scholars right away saw that there's a direct connection between these Sumerian myths that were on the tablets and the Babylonian and the Akkadian and Assyrian, all very similar, seem to be giving a foundation to the later stories in the Old Testament. That they're not really God stories. They're more like, they're not specifically religious stories that apply to any one religion. It's more of a global thing that they're talking about. And of course, the premise of this book and his other books, and actually a lot of scholars, this is sort of the best kept secret of archaeology and religion at this point. As he said before, that many pastors have spoken to him and said, look, I can't talk about this from the pulpit, but okay, we kind of hear where you're coming from, and we kind of agree, including the former linguist to the Vatican, which I love that story. So anyway, that these are stories of paleocontact, that the Elohim is the equivalent of the Anuna or the Anunnaki, also known as, aka, the sky people. So for 150 years, Christian academics have inarguably known all this, but it isn't taught to the millions globally in Christian churches. This is a gigantic paradigm shifting, huge challenge to people's belief systems. Paul had that unfortunate moment of enforced downtime when he broke his leg, and he took that as an opportunity to do some digging into information that had bothered him, the inconsistencies, for a long time. And at first he said he was shocked to see that Christian God stories are a retelling of far older tales of non-human contact with our very early ancestors. For example, the Elohim, the powerful ones, in Hebrew, it means the sky armies, and they became known as the Council of Power. And obviously, in the story, they came as an army of invasion. Maybe not specifically said in exactly the words that just came out of my mouth, but that's the obvious conclusion that can be drawn. And there was no resistance possible. I mean, our own military has recently said on national television in front of Congress that really we would have no recourse. If there was aggression, there would be nothing we could do about it. And because it's advanced power. They had advanced power in the past. We just call it technology, but it's advanced. For example, in the Old Testament, they talk about the Ruach. Almost sounds Irish, the Ruach, you know. It's a flying object that created vortices of wind to drive back the flood waters in Genesis. Then there's the kavod of Ezekiel, and that's associated with landing and launching. So that's a technological object. And then it also is described involving smoke and fire, and it has the capability of carrying passengers. So, what kind of religious thing is that? Later, Isaiah described the reaction when the people were not obedient to Yahweh. Now, this is going to be a story that taken directly from the Old Testament. The people refused to walk in his ways, Yahweh's, nor were they obedient to his laws. So Yahweh poured upon his own people fury from his nose, his great power in battle, and set all the people on fire, burning them alive until there was nothing left of them. Because he's a loving God. That's not in the Bible, that's me. Just as there was no love from the Elohim towards their allotted humans, there was not a lot of love among the Elohim either. Each people group was jealously guarded by their respective Elohim. This jealousy is enshrined in the words of the 10 Commandments of Yahweh, in which the Elohim, by that name, tells his people, "You will put no other Elohim before me. You must not serve them or bow down to them or even depict them, for your powerful one, Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous, powerful one." And that's from Exodus, if you want to check it out. Where am I here? So there was this insistence on the part of Yahweh on the exclusive loyalty, and on each of these powerful beings, their little tribe. They wanted total loyalty, just like nations want you to identify with them today, that sense of, patriotism. Yahweh was much worse, much worse of an overlord. He was angry. And if he didn't approve on something, about something, there are depictions of him losing his temper, and other powerful looking gods in conflict with him, and he's quoted as saying, "I am the Lord thy God," meaning you guys, I'm in charge of you guys. Solomon embraced their memory, and he dedicated his art and memorials in the honor of the memory of these Elohim, and he supported the story of paleocontact. Solomon didn't pretend it was anything other than that. But kings and priests of Yahweh, they wanted to purge these memories because, control. Ezekiel has an encounter with non-human agents and their technology, their weaponry, and an attempt at a purge. There's a devastating effect of the weapons that's described, and they're shown to Ezekiel in an unimaginable scale, is how it's described. And it's the destroyer device, or the disintegrating device, to wipe out entire areas. Anyone who's against the active paleocontact, it's going to get it. Paul Wallis names modern catastrophes, then compares the people lost to what was lost in these stories of the Bibles, and actually the loss of life was worse under the control of Yahweh. So these stories have been manipulated through time to speak of people who engage in idolatry and then divine punishment as a result. But removing that lens and looking at the linguistics, they really are a story of invasion and colonization, martial law, and control of the population. And this is what we're getting to, the crux of this story here now. We're going to be, Paul, I'm taking credit for the book. I'm just telling you the story. Paul is going to be drawing a thread between this colonization, invasion, colonization, and imposition of control in our past, continuing through history, and into today. And he will be describing a variety of different cultures that have experienced the same thing, and their origin stories reflect that. He hears the same basic story in the outline of his friend Cam from Hawaii. And a lot of these stories, this is so interesting, are dragon tales. And the stories might be a little different. Sometimes they're snakes, and sometimes they're some kind of reptile or a dragon, but the story itself unfolds the same. It's identical. So now Paul is looking at dragons differently. He sees stories of loss of land and culture, loss of rights, loss of freedom, and eventual enslavement. And he tells of land annexation, division, and new laws. Just as an aside, the other day, I did a little bit of a lengthy video. I apologize. On basically what you would call repetition of imposed poverty throughout history and how that's reflected in the new budget. And my big example was the Victorian workhouse. And I found it fascinating story. I had to share it, and I hope that you guys will go back and listen to that, because the pattern is so clear to me. This is the same oligarchical takeover that's happening. And he says that the same story, taking the land, imposing control, is the same in Deuteronomy. The lands of the Middle East were subdivided by the Elohim as overlords in the aftermath of this invasion. The past traditions and claims no longer applied, claims to land no longer applied, and the new order prevailed, and resistance is futile. And the same scheme is repeated globally, and I would say historically. In the Bible, there are more complicated stories. Yahweh gets people but no land. This is, the Israelis, the Israelites wandering in the desert. They have no citizenship, and it's an injustice. And this, he says intentionally, creates conflict and competition. And when Moses encounters Yahweh, he's already dealing with a displaced and landless people, if you remember, who are made more powerless, even yet, by the laws that Yahweh hands down. Cam, his friend in Hawaii, equates this with the Maui fires. The poor lost everything. The most recent fires in Maui. The poor lost everything. And then the vultures, the speculators, the land developers swooped in and bought the property off of these people whose homes had burned down because they couldn't get the insurance help. They couldn't get enough money. There weren't enough resources to build, and they needed a place to live. So out of desperation, they sold their plot at a loss to these speculators. This is the same story that's in the Bible. He calls them vultures, and that's exactly what they were. The lack of compassion, exploiting people after a disaster. This is a corporate land grab, which is essentially what we saw that drove people to end up in Victorian workhouses. There was no longer a recourse, an alternative. Traditional lands have been taken with new laws, privatization over the models of land that have ownership that have been used by Aboriginal people for a very long time. And the Native people are forced into living in cars and tents. And that's what's happening in Hawaii. It's what happened in Australia. It's happening in the US now all over the place. Look what happened in 2007-8 with the mortgage collapse. Just another invasion, just another overthrow. History repeats itself. So I have in the margin here for this next part. These are not my words, YouTube. So I'm going to be a little cautious here while I read my notes. I don't remember what this is about. Cam talks, he said in the past, about bird people. And Paul links this to many cultural stories of children. Okay. So I'm going to hint around here, and I think you're all smart enough to know what I'm talking about. There is a popular, I'll call it fantasy, entertained by a group that starts with the letter of the alphabet. That's their only name, the letter of the alphabet today in modern America. And this repeats a terrible story called the blood libel that was an accusation against the Jews, an anti-Semitic fable that has repeated itself through history. It actually began, I think, in the Middle Ages. But this story is repeated in many cultures in different iterations, but it's essentially the same story: the taking of children for this purpose, the consumption of vital fluids. It's even been repeated in Jim Henson's work and in The Simpsons. It's such a trope that people are familiar with. Paul here describes institutional behavior that's so common in the news today, residential schools and what they found buried, and, he claims that little is said about the part that the elite social levels play in the actual organization of this sort of malign behavior. And it was told to him and to the clergy that it would not be scrutinized because it would implicate too many powerful people. This is what he has heard. It awakened Paul to the reality of some of these fantasy movies and scripts and theories and stories, and he says he can't unknow the truth. It's hard to talk about this and be more clear specifically because there are provisions in YouTube that don't allow it. But I'm hoping that, go to chapter 6 of the book. Go to chapter 6. It's elucidated a bit more than I can actually say in words right here. But I think everybody gets the point. The Mayans associated this treatment of the young. Now we're talking about, what we're talking about on the altars at the tops of the pyramids, with the approval of their feathered serpent god. What was to be gained from it? Why the offerings? Why was that? The Bible calls them Moloch sacrifices, and this is a device to display total control over humans. So it's not that they were getting anything out of it. It was to impose control on people. So in that sense, they were getting control, but it was a method of imposing control out of, fear and complicity in this terrible action. If an Elohim could get a human to do such a thing, especially a firstborn son, it was a show of total control. If you can get human beings to do that, then you have completely broken them. There onwards, you will find you can get them to do anything. And we have the story of Abraham and his son and the burning bush, and then the last minute reprieve. That's significant. And this story about Isaac and Abraham absolutely mirrors Hawaiian ancestral tales. There's another term for this. It's collective cultural trauma. Cam's story of the Ahumanu. When you see it written down, it looks like a human, like not human. And it's very, very like the Latin for not human. Stories of abductions by beings from the sea are really common in Ireland. There's, the Silkies, and similar stories in Africa. Stories about underwater cities made by hybrids and populated by captured people. They look like us so that they can live among us, but they are not of us. Paul had many people reach out with similar stories. There's interesting stories in his last book, I think, and he goes back over it here, that he heard it from his in-laws these similar stories, but also from his Welsh ancestors. Kidnappers are beautiful on the surface in the Welsh stories, but not human, but they entice people. And so we're talking about the lure of the mermaids, the sirens on the rocks. These stories are repeated. Why would completely disparate cultures, different times, separated by geography that could not be traversed, how did they end up with all these similar stories? So from his in-laws, he heard the Ghanaian tales, which are very similar. Again, according to Ghanaian tradition, victims are not taken by force. Rather, they're enticed by adventure, health, wealth, and heightened abilities. Oddly, both the Ghanaian and Welsh stories include the unlikely aspect of abductees being returned a few years after their disappearance, having been used for hybridization and now being surplus to requirements. My next surprise was to learn of a close family connection with a family from Anloga in the Kita district of Ghana's Volta region who had experienced this phenomenon within my lifetime. And he went on to explain in the other book about the young woman that was taken. In fact, I do have it written out here. He said also these tales are told in Kenya, the Philippines, Trinidad and Tobago, New Guinea, Belize, and then the Silkies of Ireland. So I'm going to read this half a page to you because it's too hard to synopsize. We're talking about your book today, he was told. My sister and I were remembering how Mami Wata was known in our district. We were never taught about it in school, but in our families, we knew about these abductions. As we talked together, my sister reminded me of an auntie of ours. Now, this is a relative by marriage. She said, "Don't you remember? Auntie Grace was gone for 3 years and nobody knew where she was. When she came back, she told us that it was the Mami Wata people, this is, the ocean people, who had taken her and that they'd kept her in a city under the ocean. She told us she had children while she was with them, and when she came back, her doctor confirmed that she really had given birth to children. After she came back to us, our auntie was different. Even though they had kept her by force, she missed them. And she said they were very beautiful people. Every morning she would go down to the beach and stare at the water. Our family all laughed at her and said she was worshiping idols in the water. I don't think she was. I think she was grieving. But even our relatives who laughed at Auntie knew that something real had happened, and it was something very strange. Because in the time that she was away, somehow her eyelids had been altered and her eyes would often stream with tears. And my sister was right. Even though our relatives did not want to believe what our auntie was telling us, we knew something had happened to her that we could not explain. And I think it's important to add this little addendum to the story. This is not a circumstance, an area, a culture where you just, go to visit a relative for 9 months and come back without a child. It's not that. And I think that needs to be made clear. But since this, he's heard many other stories, and he sees a common thread of trauma and embarrassment. Nick Pope, the Ministry of Defense in England, talks about the human interface, the motif of underwater bases. Now, Nick Pope no longer is in that job, and I am dying. I would love to talk to him and find out, why did he leave that job? Because his office investigated these reports. And in 2017, the idea of underwater bases was validated by the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Chris Mellon, who made videos in 2004, and then the Pentagon, he made them in 2004, showed them in 2017, and the Pentagon reiterated by showing more and confirming the stories in 2019. It showed footage of things flying out of the sky that the whole entire Navy sitting on the USS Nimitz had no idea what they were looking at, and fly around, toy with their fighter pilots, and then go in the water fly into the ocean, and then come back out. And these are called transmedium. No, it's all domain anomalies is what their title is. This is the military's official name for these things that go from sky to water and back out to space. All domain anomalies, which show transmedium ability in the air, the atmosphere, in the ocean, and in outer space. There's a commonality here with these non-human hybridizers. They have been here for a very long time, everywhere around the globe. And Paul said, you know, you can pretty safely characterize this as an occupation. The term non-human distinguishes these from ETs because they live here. They're not extraterrestrial. They actually live here on the planet. They are terrestrial and often even look just like us. And they were invaders at the beginning of paleocontact. Cam tells Paul that for 100 years the U.S. government was not allowed to speak about this, and not allowed to use the actual original names of these non-human entities. It was against the law to remember. So in the Hawaiian culture imposed by the U.S. Occupiers, the people had these names and had these stories and knew about them. They were forbidden to talk about them. This is officially a suppression of indigenous memory. And we know that this has happened over and over in the United States, in Canada, Australia, Ireland. I mean, I have to speak up. Indigenous languages, illegalized. Traditional cultures, outlawed. Initiation programs, forbidden. Children kidnapped and detained in schools run by church organizations. Hair was shaved. They were terrorized. And this went on from the 1880s to the 1980s in many places, including areas of Hawaii, indigenous people of Hawaii. I have a really good friend whose husband is Hawaiian. And his family, fully indigenous Hawaiian, actually did live in a village, I don't know, a community on the beach in Kauai. There are places in Kauai that are kind of undeveloped from Western culture still. Canada had the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address this brutality and violence again, and of these policies that they imposed on their indigenous people. They call them the First Nations. Paul talks of extreme, I wrote uber government. I don't know if that was Paul's term or my shorthand, but it fits. International shadowy powers who have controlled the elected governments. And, you know, I think it's fair to interject here that we're not talking about fringe, sort of hysterical, conspiratorial notions. You know, we're not talking about Michael Flynn. We're talking about Paul Wallis and any number of respected thinkers, scientists, leaders, you know, people who work in the Vatican. You know, you don't get that job if you're a little, you know, unstable. At least not to start. And I think it's important to know that these are legitimate people with these sorts of opinions. Some authority higher than national governments with a policy to eradicate the memory and traces of indigenous populations have been hard at work for a very long time. And why? The question begs to be asked. Why? What power did these narratives have over governments that feared them because the governments capitulated? What official narrative and church orthodoxy did they contradict? Great question. So Chaim Eshad, I hope I said that right, is an Israeli. He worked for I hope this is written down because I can't remember, some intelligence in Israel. He said that our governments have agreed with our non-human visitors program of research. So in 2020, this guy who's in the know and connected said that research is being conducted. So, okay, what? These abductions, were they researched too? And these invasions, we're calling them invasions for the sake of argument, ended up with huge cultural shifts, which we have seen. So chapter 7, anomalies and biologics. So the bakery on the beach is where he is, September of 2023, having a conversation with his friend Will. And they're talking about the Pentagon and David Grush, who is the intelligence officer who was a whistleblower. And he said this has nothing to do with transparency. This has to do with freedom to speak and not falling for the deception. And his friend Will says, he's arguing, taking the opposite tact. And he says the ETs are not non-human biologics. What does that even mean, really? And Grush, he says, is an expert in transmedium anomalies. And I won't tell you what I wrote in the margins, but apparently this argument is very confusing because something's going on. And for example, Grush admits that, I hope I pronounced that right, that he never saw actual ET technology. And Will said he's not 100% a skeptic. He admits that it could be possible that there's life on other planets and that paleocontact could be possible, but he's definitely making it an uphill climb for Paul. And Paul explains in military language, transmedium anomaly is just a fancy term for UFO. Non-human biologic is just a fancy term for ET. And the Pentagon studies what they call all domains. So we're talking about an interaction with something unexplainable so far that moves seamlessly between the oceans, the atmosphere, and space. Grush was cleared to talk. He got permission to talk as much as he did to the edge of what it was okay for the public to hear. There's a point past which he wouldn't go. He told Nancy Mace, the most stable of audience, he told Nancy Mace, yes, we have bodies. They are or were alive, but it's too secret for me to tell you what that's all about. So Grush keeps the door open by not using the word alien because they're so much like us. And like we said just a minute ago, maybe they're not extraterrestrial. Oh, that's the next sentence. Maybe they're not extraterrestrial. He doesn't comment on what they look like or where they're originally from. Paul points out that our ancestors often call these same entities spirits because they came and went by ways that our ancestors didn't understand because of the technology involved. There's an ancient precedent for current ET and UFO sightings, but we're just not calling them gods or, holy beings, religious characters. Grush's job is not about having eyes on all this stuff. Those who have the eyes on them they're even in a more top secret situation and can talk even less. Grush pointed out that he couldn't share what the government would not share with him or what he was not allowed to talk about. He isn't isn't something I can't read my writing. This is really pathetic. But the explanation is, what would be the advantage of the purpose? He isn't a shill. Oh, shill. I thought I said shill, and that didn't make sense. Paul is making the argument that this whistleblower is not a mouthpiece for the government giving us what they want us to know, because what would be the advantage or the purpose? They're upsetting Congress, getting them all worked up, and military intelligence, and they both look impotent and shifty as a result. So there's no advantage to the Pentagon, there's no advantage to Congress that allows this whistleblower to go ahead and talk, and they're intentionally pulling the strings and letting them do it, because all it's serving to do is making them all look bad. It makes the Pentagon look weak and unable to defend us, and it makes the Congress look like liars, using taxpayers' money and not saying anything, and then telling us there's nothing to see. So Paul agrees that there must be an end game in mind, and it might not have to do with disclosure. It might have more to do with the agenda of all of this. And he says, we'll talk about it later in the book. So basically, for the time being, it boils down to this. Congress is being kept in the dark, and there are certain members who don't like that. And I can quite understand why. They believe their exclusion from this information is unconstitutional. But are they right? And is David Grush right when he says that his exclusion from information about the program is illegal? That's the question. We're going to work on the answer. In England, intelligence keeps elected government in the dark on principle. That's like their job, is to do that. The Secret Service gets its authority from the crown and not from the people. That's how they get around. That's what we had a revolution about. Therefore, the government is used by being shut out. The British government is just shut out. What is the basis for secrecy in the United States? Because they are accountable to the people. If there is a legal basis for withholding this information from the people, what is it? And why do intelligence agencies keep secrets from one another? Paul says, let me remind you of the quote, "In a house divided," Richard Dolan, researcher and author, who's written some fabulous, fabulous books, says, I would say that Grosh is technically correct when he says it's illegal, and he knows secrets that I don't know. But I do know the U.S. intelligence community is accountable to the president. Oh, great. And the president legally is responsible to the citizens of the United States. Theoretically, we don't have a crown. The people are sovereign. Legally, technically, that's how it's supposed to be, but it could be legal illegality. It's illegal, but they make it legal. For example, the whole idea of a black budget is not supposed to be legal in the United States, but we still have them, and we call them special access programs. Paul thinks that something is up and that the government has information, and there's an escalation of insurance against disclosure. Is the government throwing military intelligence under the bus because of political fallout and the loss of trust that disclosure will cause? And is disclosure imminent? So just to go over this one more time, since at least World War II, Roswell, all that stuff, the government has undoubtedly known quite a bit. And, it goes the continuum of, well, they saw things that couldn't identify, to they have technology, spacecraft, and bodies. So it's all, the whole continuum. But there has been, over time, more and more secrecy. Allegedly, back engineering, allegedly, reproductions of what they found, even allegedly negotiations with other entities. All this is in the pot. And what funds these programs? Money from the budget that goes to the Pentagon, taxpayer money. Under law, they're accountable to Congress. Congress has never heard anything about it. So there's no accountability. That's against the Constitution. Secrecy being withheld from the American people, all of this information, it's not going to be popular. It's going to make them look criminal. It can be even allegedly treasonous to withhold this kind of information and then spend that money without accountability. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says, hey, we can't protect you. That's not a good look. So they're in a quandary. The government blames the Pentagon and says, they kept all of us in the dark. And Ross Coulthart, who, the Australian 60 Minutes guy, we've done his book in plain sight. Love to talk to him. He asks, does the government want this to come out in a spill inside the Congress, or does it want it to present it as a government that's in charge, that's able to tell the people the truth? It's as simple as that. In other words, do they just want it to be revealed as gossip, as just big revelation? Or do they want to control the narrative and tell people what really happened and seem like maybe they've got a grip on things? Marco Rubio tried to add an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to give Congress the power to demand the information, but it was tabled by Schumer. So there's very powerful anti-disclosure laws that kept the Manhattan Project secret, and they kept it secret. And this empowers the Pentagon's secrecy, and it has done for decades. But not only the USA is dealing with this. In 2019, France had a big thing. 2021, Israel did. In the 2000s, Paul Hellyer in Canada came out and said there has been alien contact since at least the 1960s. I was so excited when I read this in Paul Wallis's book, because a long time ago, 20 years ago, before he died, I heard an interview with Paul Hellyer, and he said this. I heard the words come out of his own mouth, that he has sat across the table, the negotiating table, with representatives of the Canadian government, American government, and entities. And this man is renowned and respected. He worked for 3 different administrations as the equivalent of the American Secretary of State. He's just was considered this illustrious person in Canada, and everybody thought I was hallucinating. I didn't know where I'd seen it. I used to take care of the elderly, and when they were napping, I'd watch these things, or I would read them, and it all becomes a big mishmash. So when I saw Paul Wallis validate this, I was just thrilled, because Paul Hellyer indeed did say he had sat across the negotiating table from ETs. In 2009, the Vatican said that contact is coming sooner than anyone expects. I would argue it's already happened, but okay. The ETs are totally other kind of being, which merits study. Russia. Dmitry Medvedev, when he took over for Putin, remember they had kind of a joint presidency and they shared a year or two and they traded back and forth. When he was in charge, he admitted it was real. In the UK, Gary McKinnon, a software engineer, would not extradite him to the US to go to trial for revealing information, being a whistleblower. He got into NASA's files with a password, and he saw files confirming that ETs and humans have collaborated. Some sort of diplomatic collaboration. This is the big picture. Paul went from biblical translations to this stuff, which is pretty dramatic departure. And we're on chapter 8, and I think I have enough time to do chapter 8. It's called Beginnings and Catastrophes, Questions of Australia. Queensland, Australia, 2024. You have to forgive me, my handwriting is atrocious. Paul was told that he had to suffer the fiery tortures for leading people away from the truth because, he's an archdeacon in the Anglican Church. He's a big shot. He might not characterize it like that. He was a big shot. And all of a sudden he's talking about, spaceships and alien beings. And it wasn't well received. There was a violent objection to all of this. He also hears from academics and experts who tell him, good for you for putting the taboo issues on the table. I would argue that, thank God for people like that. He points out that the part of the biblical Hebrew canon that records invasion, land division, annexation of societies by non-humans is either missed or ignored or not preached. So it's accidentally not seen, or it's intentionally ignored, or they just don't bother to talk about it. So now we get to the issue of religion. And this is coming from Paul Wallis, but, I'm not going to argue. Religion's control with fear and they try to get people to stay hanging on to their beliefs. And he reminds us the Bible is not one book. It's a collection. It's a library of ancient texts that have been compiled, edited, redacted, to the current form about 6th century BCE, and they tried to create a coherent whole, but what they were going for was a story of monotheism, but the original stories just bleed through. It's almost impossible to avoid them. These are the narratives similar to the Sumerians and, Akkadians and all those guys. And these narratives show the turning point in human history from ancestral memory. So Genesis has 7 stories of beginnings, cataclysms, and ET contact. And he kind of goes through them one by one. The Genesis 1, he said, there's a reboot of Earth life. There was an ecologically chaotic world. The Elohim were powerful ones who arrived in a wind machine, cleared and separated the waters, cleared the air, rehabilitated life, helped with plants, animals, and then humans. And this story, this essential outline, is echoed in Sumeria, the Mayans, Nigeria, the Philippines, Iroquois. And he said this is, and it goes on and on. He said this is the story of survivors. In the Chinese version, dragons with compassion try to help the starving people. It's a story of a new beginning for the few people that are left on Earth, and these dragons try to help. Genesis, the second part, talks about the advent of human males and females. They were engineered from organic matter, at least man was, and then the woman. And also, this story is repeated in other cultural texts. The first man was in harmony with the environment, and advanced non-human entities, often a female non-human entity, introduces more. Let's talk about that. Introduces the primitive man to more developed food, to alcohol, to sexuality, to clothing, and to city living. And he said these are actually the roots of the Mowgli and Tarzan stories. If you think back, primitive guy raised with the apes, and it's a woman. He encounters a woman who helps him to become civilized. An oral tradition of the Zulu people tells them an advanced non-human female entity called Mabab Mwana Waresa, and she introduces the distant ancestors of the Zulu people to the cultivation of crops and to beer. 2 important food groups. In Nigerian mythology, it is once again the female who initiates a life of farming and self-sufficiency, raising the human condition from one of dependence on the advanced beings who hitherto have fed and nurtured them. For these primordial beings, farming was their escape from being dependent on and controlled by non-human overlords. Through farming, they became an independent, fertile civilization and began to take over the planet as a new alpha species. Okay, this is a good place to stop, I think. So that's the story of Genesis 2. And this is the end of video number 3. And we'll be on video number 4 here in a second. Thank you for watching. I hope you're enjoying this. I think it's just such an interesting intellectual exercise. I love it. So, Slán go fóill. Sláinte.